In this lecture, we're going to discuss Hume's problem of induction, another form of skepticism, in particular, a form of skepticism about induction and about the future. David Hume was a philosopher in the 1700s in England and Scotland. He was of Scottish descent. He was sort of an atheist for reasons that will become clear, or at least an agnostic, and he basically started at least one branch of what we today would call psychology, basically thinking about beliefs and desires and the relation between them in order to predict people's activity and behavior. He was a staunch empiricist, which means that he believed that all knowledge ultimately comes by way of the senses. And because of this, he had a big problem with the sort of metaphysical theorizing of his time, in particular, thinking that we simply weren't going to be able to know anything about metaphysics, about God, about God's relation to humanity, about whether or not angels existed, about all kinds of things like that. He had a big problem with certain kinds of metaphysical theorizing. One of the reasons for this was because Hume had this sort of dilemma. He thought that ultimately all legitimate forms of reasoning were divided into two different kinds. So there's reasoning, he thought, regarding relations between ideas. And this kind of reasoning is basically what he thought math was. Anything that we normally think of as what I called previously a priori. Things where there's terms and we understand that the terms relate to each other. Basically, Hume thinks, okay, these are ideas that you have and you're relating these ideas sort of in your mind, right? 2 + 2 = 4. You know that that's true, not because you've seen something about it out in the world, but because you've sort of thought about the idea of 2 and the idea of 4 and the idea of plus, and you've related them sufficiently. Similarly, that all bachelors are men. You know what a bachelor is. You don't have to go out into the world in order to determine that all bachelors are men, because you know that, part of what it is to be a bachelor, the idea of a bachelor, involves the idea of being a man. The other kind of reasoning that Hume allows for is reasoning regarding facts in the world. And these are things like observable events, objects, properties, things like that. So Hume thought, okay, so there's these kinds of things that you can know that are the relationships between ideas, and these kinds of things that you can know by going out in the world and seeing particular things act and behave in particular ways, or be particular ways, like that the ball is red, that the sun rose this morning. But he thought that any other form of reasoning that relies, that functions any other way, that's not explicable in terms of a relationship between ideas or as a kind of fact about the world, he thinks that none of those forms of reasoning are ultimately going to be legitimate. In fact, he thought that they were so illegitimate that they ought to be cast into the flames. He stated it this way: if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it contained nothing but sophistry and illusion. But here you might start to think, wait a minute, what about, there are certain kinds of things that we do seem to know a bit about that don't really seem to be about necessarily matters of fact that we've experienced, nor mere relationships between ideas. In particular, thoughts about the future. So there's clearly, it seems like, a number of things that we know about the future right now, right? So I know that the next president of the United States is going to be the person that wins the most electoral college votes in the next election, right? Similarly, I know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, that my house is still going to be standing tomorrow, that there will be food in my refrigerator, that water will flow from my taps, etc. Right? I mean, it seems like I know these things, you know these things, you know these things about yourself and your own life, right? The question here becomes how we know these things. So I suggest try for yourself to justify any particular belief that you have about the future. So take, for example, that tomorrow there's going to be nice weather in Santa Barbara. Something that I pretty much am pretty certain of. I think I know this, right? How do I know it? Well, Santa Barbara usually has nice weather. How do I know that Santa Barbara usually has nice weather? Well, in the past, Santa Barbara has had consistently nice weather, and I've experienced it, right? But how can I like be certain that that will continue? And how can just the fact that Santa Barbara had nice weather in the past lead me to believe that Santa Barbara will have nice weather tomorrow? And it seems like, I guess generally things pretty much stay the same, right? They don't change much. If there was nice weather earlier this week, there's going to continue to be nice weather. Now, of course, there's not always the case, but it's usually the case, right? But how ultimately do I know that just because things were similar in the past, they're going to continue to be similar in the future? If we apply Hume's dilemma, or sort of his fork, his two ways of thinking about kinds of statements and things that we can know, to this, the notion of like knowledge of the future, we get a puzzle. And the puzzle is this. There's this metaphysical claim that we might call the future-like past principle. The future-like past principle says that the future will be just like the past. Whatever happens in the future is going to be pretty similar or pretty much the same as like stuff that happened in the past. This principle seems like the kind of thing that you have to rely on in order to know anything about the future, right? Because if you give some belief that you have about the future and you ask yourself, why do you think that? Ultimately, you generally come back to this principle that says, well, because this is kind of how it's happened before. But then the question becomes, well, what reason do you have for thinking that just because this happened that way in the past, it's going to continue to happen that way in the future? So the future-like past principle comes into question, and Hume then gets to ask, well, wait a minute, I've got this dilemma, or this sort of distinction between reasoning as between matters of ideas and reasoning between matters of fact. So this future-like past principle, what kind of a principle is it? Is it a relationship between ideas? Is it really, when you say that the future will be like the past, is that just like all bachelors are men, like that the future is inherently somehow and the past are inherently somehow just ideas and they're related in a special way? Or is that the future will be just like the past, some kind of matter of fact that you can, experience or go experiment on? Ultimately, it kind of looks like neither, right? I mean, the future will be just like the past. You couldn't experience that, right? I mean, like how could you? You'd have to be in the future to know that it's like the past. And it's also not clearly a simple relationship between ideas, because it doesn't seem like we're just sort of defining terms here. So the question again comes up, when we've got propositions that are about the future, what are they? Are they propositions about matters of fact, or are they propositions about relations of ideas? Well, for the most part, propositions about the future are propositions about matters of fact. We don't really think about relations of ideas in the future. So they've got to be somehow kind of empirical, right? They've got to be, and the idea here is like, obviously, if you have some belief about the future, whether or not that belief, ends up being true, whether or not you end up knowing that, is going to depend on whether or not that future thing actually happens, right? So there's got to be this future event that's going to happen, and if you know that it's going to happen now, then it ultimately will happen. But then the reasoning that you have for believing it right now is, in a way, depends on this other proposition this proposition that the future is going to be like the past. But what is that? Does that count also as a matter of fact, or does that count as a relation of ideas? And if it's neither, then according to Hume, it ought to be committed to the flames, and we shouldn't be relying on it. And this ultimately creates Hume's problem of induction. So now the problem of induction is like this. Look, you believe that tomorrow is going to be much like it is today, right? You think that the sun's going to rise again, that gravity is still going to work, right? That when you open your eyes after sleeping, things around your room are going to look pretty much the same as they always have. But what reason do you really have for thinking that? What reason do you have for being so sure that all these things are going to stay the same? The reason that you probably ultimately have for thinking that things are going to be similar tomorrow as they were today is the future like past principle. This principle is ultimately something that undergirds all of inductive reasoning, all reasoning from past experiences to future generalizations. So, remember back to the thinking like, oh, every swan that I have seen in the past has been white, so every future swan that I see will also be white. Right? That's a kind of reasoning. And if you've seen, hundreds of swans, it seems like a good kind of reasoning. But what reason do you have for thinking that, right? What reason do you have for thinking that just because you've seen a bunch of something that's worked one way in the past, that it's going to continue to work that way in the future? Like, maybe you've just got too small of a sample size, and maybe things are going to change. What reason do you have for thinking that things aren't going to change, that the future is going to continue to be like the past? Here, Hume is able to come up with basically an argument against the future like past principle, or against believing in the future like past principle. He doesn't show that the principle itself is false. He just shows that there's no good reason to believe it. And we're following here Dan Corman's version, basically, of this kind of argument that's been presented in some of the reading. So the future like past principle is unjustified, according to this argument. And here's how it goes. If your belief in the future like past principle is justified, then it is either justified by direct observation, that is, you saw that it was true, or by inductive reasoning, because inductive reasoning is the kind of thing that you are allowed to do, in science. That's the thought. Premise 2, your belief in the future like past principle isn't justified by direct observation. Premise 3, your belief in the future like past principle isn't justified by inductive reasoning. Conclusion, so your belief in the future like past principle is unjustified. And so, if it's unjustified, then you shouldn't believe it, and you shouldn't think that you know it. Now, what we need to do here in order to sort of clarify this argument is explain each of the premises. Now, premise 1 states that if your belief in the future like past principle is justified, then it's either justified by direct observation or inductive reasoning. The thought here clearly being that if you have a reason for believing that the future is going to be like the past, either you must have a reason that's based on directly observing it, right? If you've directly observed that the future will always be like the past, then okay, great, you've got a reason for thinking it, right? Like, but then there's this, there's going to be this problem. How do you directly observe that the future is always like the past? Or you might have a good inductive reason for thinking that the future will be like the past, because you've seen in the past a bunch of times where the future was like the past, right? And inductive reasoning is this kind of reasoning by recognizing that certain things have occurred a number of times, and generalizing on the basis of that evidence. Premise 2 says that your belief in the future like past principle is not justified by direct observation. In fact, that it can't be justified by direct observation because you can't observe that the future like past principle is true. Why not? Well, because in order to observe that it were true, you'd have to be able to observe the future. but you can't observe the future until it happens. So you can't really step outside of time or space or whatever to determine whether or not the future will be like the past, or the present. You would need to, and you would ultimately need to do so. You would have to step outside of time in order to observe that the future and the past match up. So, I mean, maybe in some sense, if you had like a time machine, or you can imagine like God somehow standing outside of time and seeing, oh, this future thing is much like this past thing, and so because, maybe he's justified by observation, but human beings, we're stuck in time, so we can't just directly observe that the future is like the past. But what about premise 3? Premise 3 states that your belief in the future like past principle isn't justified by inductive reasoning. Why should we think that premise 3 is true? Like, maybe we shouldn't, right? I mean, haven't we seen in the past that, the future from the past, imagine 3 days ago and then 2 days ago. So 2 days ago was future for 3 days ago. Haven't we seen in the past that the future has been like the past, right? So what was going on 2 days ago happened to be pretty much like what was going on 3 days ago. And because we've seen this sort of over and over and over again, right, we can use induction to make plausible the claim that the future will continue to be like the past, and so it seems likely that always the future is going to be like the past. And doesn't that justify the future like past principle? Well, not so fast. There's a problem with thinking that the future like past principle can be justified on the basis of inductive reasoning. And the reason is that it's circular. All inductive reasoning about the future assumes the truth of the future like past principle to begin with. And if inductive reasoning about the future assumes the truth of the future like past principle, then inductive reasoning is ultimately, especially inductive reasoning about the future like past principle, is ultimately circular. No belief can be justified on the basis of circular reasoning, and so the future like past principle isn't justified by inductive reasoning. Now you might think, well, wait a minute, circularity doesn't seem terribly bad. Well, let me just show you why it is. So here's a really bad argument for God's existence. Suppose someone says, well, look, the Bible says that God exists, so God exists. And you ask, well, why should we believe that the Bible, why should we believe that the Bible says that God exists? Why should we believe what the Bible says? And the response that you get maybe is something like, well, because God created the Bible, and so the Bible must be true. Now, ultimately, this is a terrible argument because it assumes that God exists in order to prove that God exists, right? If you think, God must have existed in order to make the Bible accurate, and then you want to say, well, and then the Bible says the accurate thing, that God exists, and then ultimately that ends up being justified on the basis of the fact that God exists, that's really problematic. This is problematic circular reasoning. And this is a reason for thinking that circular reasoning is generally bad. What we don't want in this case is for the future like past principle to end up coming up in the justification for our reasoning to thinking that the future like past principle itself is a good thing to believe. And so if we're going to use inductive reasoning to defend the future like past principle, or to justify the future like past principle, we better not have the future like past principle show up in the foundations of our inductive reasoning. So why then should we think that the FLP principle is at the basis of induction? Because that seems to be that would be the problem if we're ultimately going to have to say that this kind of justification of the FLP on the basis of induction is circular. Well, think about all inductive reasoning and how inductive reasoning works. So inductive reasoning, like, the example that I've been using is a bad one, but, it works to keep going. So, suppose all observed swans have been white so far. They were at one point in, the UK. And you've, looked at thousands of swans, and you think, okay, I've seen all these swans, they've always been white. And then you ask, well, what color will the next swan that I see be, white or non-white? Now, if you are pulled towards thinking, okay, well, the next one that I see is going to be white, if you can understand someone's reasoning along those lines, um, like why they would choose white over the other, you got to ask, well, why? Why are they thinking that? And if it's because they've seen 1,000 white swans in the past, then bam, right? You're back at it. You're reasoning using the future like past principle. You're thinking for some reason that whatever's going to be happening in the future, seeing the next one, that it's going to be similar to how things were in the past, that you're going to see a white one. So now this puts us in a pretty interesting and difficult pickle. It seems almost as if we're stuck, and it seems difficult to see how we could ultimately trust induction. And most of science, functions using induction, and so it seems really odd to be stuck in this pickle. If induction relies on the future like past principle, and the future like past principle is just not justified in and of itself, um, because we can't observe it, and because it's not a matter of a relationship between ideas, uh, how can we possibly know anything using science, like scientifically? How can we possibly know anything where we use induction? Um, well, there's a number of different responses here, and some of them are more satisfying than others, but none of them are terribly satisfying. One thing we might say is that ultimately it seems like we have to just trust what the principle says. Uh, and ultimately, I mean, that just means saying, like, yeah, the future, we're kind of trusting, we're having faith, in a sense, in that the future is going to be like the past, unless it isn't, right? I mean, the future isn't always like the past. Sometimes things do change. But for the most part, in the very general features of the universe, things do seem to stay pretty much the same. Cats continue to be mammals, and dogs continue to bark, and my house continues to stand. Um, and so far, it seems that maybe the present is similar enough to the past, and so we just kind of keep trucking along and assuming that the present, as it continues to come, is going to continue to be like the past, and then the future is just a mere projection of the present into the future, right? We're thinking like, well, things are pretty similar, things aren't changing too much too fast. Um, but there are some other sort of major philosophical assumptions that lurk underlying the surface of the future like past principle. And those can be called into question because they're very much metaphysical assumptions of the sort that Hume wasn't excited about. And these kinds of assumptions are the reason Hume's not excited about them is because it's really hard to say that we know them. Of course, they might be true or false, regardless of whether we know them, right? I mean, if God could exist, whether or not God exists it has nothing to do with whether or not we know God exists, right? If God exists, he exists either way, right? Or he doesn't exist, and it doesn't matter, either way whether or not we believe it or not. Similarly, these other metaphysical principles undergird whether or not the future like past principle is true, but it's really hard to say that we know these things because we can't directly observe them. And these principles are things like the idea that reality ultimately, at its fundamental nature, is somehow stable, that things just don't shift at the base level of reality. I mean, and I'm not talking about how crazy the subatomic particles are, because things get pretty weird down there. But the idea that, subatomic particles continue to be subatomic particles, right? That, a quark and an electron don't somehow turn into one another at the snap of a finger, that dogs and cats don't get along and then all of a sudden do get along, right? That sometimes something can shift from like being a human being into being like a coffee mug. Like those things don't happen. That's not reality, right? Reality is somehow stable at the foundations, and if it's stable at the foundations, then maybe we can assume the future like past principle is true. But what reason do we have for thinking that reality is ultimately stable at the foundations? It doesn't seem like we have a great reason to think so on the basis of empirical reasoning, which is what Hume was ultimately on about, and this is why he thinks we should be skeptical of induction.